Today's presentation is given by Dr. Clara Sitbon from the University of Sydney, where she teaches in French and Francophone studies, and she's done a few things about islands and crime fiction. So looking forward to her talk. Clara, all yours.
Thanks, Carlos. So I'd first like to start by showing you this mural, which is one of my favorite pieces of street art, which is located in Redfern, Everleigh Street, right near the University of Sydney campus, which is where I work, which is where I carry all of my work. And so everything I'm going to talk to you about today has been conceptualized and done on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that might be joining in or listening on YouTube at a later time. And I also want to acknowledge Barbara Pizzotti here, because this work I'm presenting here is a continuation of conversations that she prompted. We had conversations together about Corsica and Sicily and Sardinia, and this is what prompted this whole work. And so I don't think it would be there if it wasn't for her work on Mediterranean crime fiction and for the conversations that we had. And so thanks for that. And more than just a fully fledged project, this is more a call to other scholars, really. Because there are things I've observed with Corsican crime fiction that I'm convinced could be applied elsewhere. And so today I'm going to talk to you about islands, because by their very nature, they offer a fascinating dichotomy of both isolation and connectivity. They're geographically detached from mainland societies, and that creates a sense of seclusion. Yet they simultaneously function as what Homi Bhabha terms the third space or third spaces, which designates sites where local and foreign influences do not merely just intermingle due to historical trade, colonization, or migration, but also generate entirely new cultural articulations that transcend the simple combination. And this liminal positioning of islands provides a rich backdrop for crime fiction, offering new ways to explore themes of isolation, community, and cultural hybridity that reshape traditional genre conventions. And this understanding of islands as unique cultural intersections invites a more theoretical approach to examining how multilingual island crime fiction, and keyword here is multilingual, operates as both a reflection of and a challenge to traditional genre conventions. And so to examine these dynamics, I want to consider multilingual island crime fiction from three complementary theoretical frameworks. First, Grant McCall's concept of nosology, which establishes islands as legitimate objects of inquiry in their own right. Homi Bhabha's theory of the third space, which I've already touched on, which helps us understand islands as sites of cultural hybridization, and Edouard Glissant's concept of archipelagic thinking, which allows us to recognize networks of relationship between island literatures that challenge mainland-centric paradigms. And together, these frameworks provide new paths to examine how multilingual island crime fiction has the potential to decenter and transform our understanding of the crime genre. And so this talk and what underpins it is an article that's been published earlier this year, but it's not a fully fledged study. It's a call to scholarly conversation. It's a call to other scholars on multilingual island crime fiction. By using these three theoretical frameworks to conceptualize multilingual island crime fiction, the aim is to lay the groundwork for more extensive analyses. And the purpose of this is to demonstrate, or to begin to demonstrate, how networks of islands in crime fiction can decenter the crime genre, while simultaneously chart a new methodological path that would invite scholars to explore these island contexts further. So I'm going to look first at nosology. Because Grant McCall is one of the first scholars to have conceptualized the idea of islands as bona fide objects of inquiry, without any idea of subjectivation or subordination. And he proposes the term nisology to designate, and I quote, the study of islands in their own terms, the open and free inquiry into islandness. And more importantly, in the context of this talk and this broader project, nisology, as McCall puts it, calls for the promotion of international cooperation and networking amongst islands. And this idea becomes crucial when we think about the place of islands within the crime genre. And I know that all the people who are here know about this already, and most, especially Barbara, she wrote a lot about it. But I want to draw on Ralph Crane and Laura Fletcher, according to whom islands are everywhere in the atlas of crime fiction. But when we look at other scholarship, and notably Eva Erdmann's topological map of international crime fiction, well, islands occupy a marginal position. And so, notwithstanding the conceptualization of islands as ideal setting for detective narratives.
Yes, it's me. Yeah.
There's been surprisingly little focus on them,
Yes.
on the part of crime fiction scholars. And interestingly, when they are examined, it's primarily executed through an Anglo-centric framework. So, for instance, Crane and Fletcher, in their work on island and crime fiction, choose to focus on Agatha Christie and G.W. Kent. And Crane's work on crime fiction in the Aegean Sea centers solely on novels written in English, when in fact there's proliferation of novels in Greek crime fiction from the Greek islands. So, as I'll explore in the next section of this talk, given the rise of multilingual crime fiction in global crime fiction, rethinking the Anglo-centric paradigm is paramount. So McCall's nisological framework offers a powerful lens through which we can reconsider crime fiction from island contexts. And by examining island crime fiction on its own terms, rather than a derivative from mainland traditions, we can identify distinct narrative patterns that emerge from the unique social, cultural, and geographical realities of island life. In the case of Corsica, for instance, the compressed space of the island transforms conventional tropes of detection and escape and creates tension through proximity rather than anonymity. Similarly, the historical positioning of many islands in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, in Polynesia and Melanesia. So the historical positioning of these islands as sites of cultural exchange and colonialism introduces complexities of authority and justice that mainland crime fiction often overlooks, and when portrays from a very stereotypical lens. More importantly, viewed through the angle of nisology, the networks between different islands where crime fiction is prominent reveal shared concerns and narrative techniques that have developed independently of, yet in dialogue with, mainland or central canonical forms. This is a phenomenon that can be observed, for instance, with Corsican crime fiction and French Caribbean crime fiction from the Antilles. And these connections are simply from a French-speaking perspective. And they invite questions over similarities with other islands where crime fiction is prominent: Cuba, Sardinia, Sicily, Mayotte, Réunion, New Caledonia, Polynesia, Haiti, and even islands, dare I extend to Japan and Southeast Asia. But they also offer an alternative genealogy of crime fiction, one that challenges the genre's presumed development, in my case, from European models, and one that reveals how island crime writers have adapted and transformed the genre to reflect their specific realities. And by adopting McCall's approach to islandness, we may uncover not just variations on established crime fiction conventions, but also potentially different conceptions of what constitutes crime, what constitutes justice, and what constitutes resolution altogether. And this need becomes more pressing given the rise in popularity of multilingual island crime fiction. I'm going to move now to island as third spaces, and I'm going to try and delve deeper into the theoretical framework that we could potentially use to focus on multilingual island crime fiction. So crime fiction narratives from islands have blossomed in the last 2 decades, and primarily in in regions where English is not the dominant language. The Mediterranean, Central America, Southeast Asia, the Sea of Islands in the Pacific, and that's only to name a few. In these narratives, detectives navigate crime scene on islands where multiple languages are spoken. They encounter cultural clashes, linguistic challenges, often in post-colonial contexts. So these multilingual and multicultural dimensions of island crime fiction point to a need for theoretical frameworks that can account for the complex cultural dynamics at play in these liminal spaces. And to understand the unique dynamics of island crime fiction fully, islands must be conceptualized not merely as geographical entities, but also as theoretical constructs that generate distinct cultural formations. And Omi Baba's concept of the third space provides a particularly productive framework for this analysis. The third space is a conceptual space that emerges in the contact zones of different cultures, where new meanings, new identities are formed through the interaction of different cultural elements. Islands embody the third space both literally and metaphorically, because they exist between mainland societies, yet they're separated from them, which creates a liminal zone where cultures don't simply mix. They also generate entirely new articulations that transcend their component parts. And in island settings, this forced proximity of different cultural traditions within limited geographical space accelerates the process of hybridization. The intense cultural negotiation produces what Baba calls the emergence of I have trouble pronouncing that word, the emergence of the interstices, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference. For crime fiction, particularly, this means that island-based narratives are not simply detective stories set on islands, but fundamentally different narrative formations which emerge from unique conditions of insularity and cultural hybridity. The detective in these narratives often embody Baba's concept of hybridity, this idea that cultural identity, especially within colonial and post-colonial contexts, is not fixed, but rather hybrid, and creates new cultural forms within the third space of encounter where power dynamics are disputed and challenged. As a result, island detectives or detective figures, because they're not always obvious detectives, operate in between cultural systems. They negotiate multiple linguistic codes, multiple power structures, which they interrogate constantly. And from this perspective, the island setting shapes a distinctive narrative in crime fiction precisely because it functions as a third space where new cultural and generic articulations emerge. And if I want to go any further here, I could invoke the concept of repeating island, which was coined by Benitez Jojo, which suggests that similar dynamics recurring across different geographical contexts occur, but each time with meaningful variations that reflect local manifestations while sharing similar characteristics. In Corsican crime fiction, for instance, we see the detective navigating between French, Italian, and Corsican influences, creating narrative forms that cannot be reduced to either just French, just Italian, or just Corsican. Similar patterns emerge in the Caribbean and arguably in Mediterranean crime fiction, where the detective must negotiate multiple cultural codes, multiple legal systems, yet each manifestation produces distinctive variations that transform the genre in unique ways. And the role of multilingual and translingual narratives in island crime fiction is pivotal in this respect. Islands often host a confluence of languages and dialects, which creates linguistic third spaces where new meanings and new identities are negotiated through language. And the linguistic hybridity serves both as a tool and as a barrier in the narrative, which add layers of complexity to communication, to identity, and belonging. And a focus on the function of multilingualism here deepens character development, plot progression, and thematic richness. And it often highlights the tensions and alliances formed between different linguistic communities as they negotiate their position within the third space of the island. And for crime fiction specifically, this theoretical synthesis, if you will, helps explain why detective figures in island narratives so often function as cultural mediators, navigating between indigenous knowledge or knowledge systems and external legal or investigative frameworks. And as I explained previously, these detectives embody the third space because they operate between cultural systems and they generate new approaches to justice and to resolution that transcend both the local and the imported legal paradigms. So this theoretical framework as islands as third spaces where hybrid cultural and linguistic form emerge provides a powerful lens for analyzing specific manifestations of island crime fiction. And Corsican crime fiction offers, in this instance, a particularly illuminating case study as its detectives navigate between French national authority, Italian cultural influence, and Corsican traditions. And by examining how Corsican crime narratives embody these principles of hybridity and third space negotiation, we can better understand the broader patterns emerging across multilingual island crime fiction, whilst appreciating the distinctive local articulation that make each island's contribution unique. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve too deep in Corsican crime fiction, but I thought it might be useful to start with a bit of geography. I'm not too sure how familiar everybody will be with Corsica, but Corsica is the small island that's dotted with red. It's French, but it's closer to Italy. Throughout most of its history, it wasn't French, and so there's rich history, lots of interesting problematics here. And I want to start with the heritage and the origin story of Corsican crime fiction. Those of you who know a little bit of French crime fiction, you can see on the French map the city of Marseille. Marseille is one of the big hubs of French crime fiction. Marseillais crime fiction exploded in the late 80s, early 90s, and crime fiction emerges from this very specific lineage. Corsican crime fiction is the granddaughter of Marseillais crime fiction because it was born out of a series of books bought in Marseille and imported into Corsica. And that's where Albiana, Corsican publisher, bought Marseillais-based Méditorial Mystery collection. And Albiana, which was founded in 1983, positioned itself as a publisher in the Mediterranean, which signaled an ambition to reach beyond Corsican shores from its inception to engage broader Mediterranean readerships. And when the Nera means black in Corsican, so the Nera series is a direct homage to the French série noire. So the French Albiana Nera series was launched in 2004 and it started with the novel that you can see on the right, L'Invitation au Trépas, which is a translated work originally written and published in Corsican under the title O Saluto di Morte that you can see on the left, which deliberately echoes the translation model of France's iconic série noire. And this inaugural choice reveals the fundamental question that this crime series seeks to both ask and answer: what is Corsican crime fiction, and how does it relate to established French crime fiction traditions whilst maintaining its regional specificity? And so I thought it would be important to also give a bit of context around how intimately linked to regional publishing dynamics French crime fiction is, because it operates under unique constraints that are imposed by the logic of regional publishing. And Corsican crime fiction is relegated to craftsmanship. Corsican crime fiction is mostly promoted in artisanal fairs. So when you go to Corsica on holidays, you want to go and explore local delicacies, you're going to go to a fair, and on one table you will see Corsican wild boar sausage. On another table, you'll see Corsican honey. On another, you'll see Corsican crime fiction, and next to that, you'll see Corsican cheese. And so this is it's an interesting thing because this cultural positioning is not a matter of choice, it's a matter of survival. Corsican crime fiction or Corsican literature, and thus Corsican crime fiction, is relegated to artisanal fare not as an aesthetic decision, but because these venues represent the only available platforms for regional cultural expression. If Corsican crime fiction is not showcased alongside regional delicacies, it risks having no showcase at all. But this constraint also creates unexpected opportunities because participation in artisanal networks allows the Corsican publisher Albiana to participate in regional fairs across mainland France and overseas, and then links are created, which opens access to markets and audiences that would otherwise remain closed to literary production. So the networks that we see between regional literature, between Corsican, Breton, Occitan, or all of these different literatures, can be mirrored in networks of islands. But this positioning also reveals the structural marginalization of regional literature within French cultural hierarchies, whilst simultaneously demonstrating how publishers like Albiana must navigate these constraints strategically. More critically, authentic Corsican crime fiction must differentiate itself from mainland French crime fiction that does portray Corsica, and very often, but 99% of the time through stereotypical or caricatured lenses that local readers cannot recognize or identify with. This creates what we might call the triple audience challenge. Corsican crime fiction must appeal simultaneously to three distinct readership, each with a different cultural expectation and level of insider knowledge. The local audience possesses intimate knowledge of Corsican values, Corsican customs, and everyday life, and demands representation that reflects lived experience. The diasporic audience, which is the audience composed of Corsicans who have left the island but return seasonally, seeks nostalgic reconnection with cultural elements they've left behind. Finally, the tourist audience approaches Corsica through preconceived notions, often shaped by stereotypical representations, requiring narratives that can engage outsiders whilst potentially challenging their assumptions, but they can't become too culturally cryptic, otherwise they remain inaccessible. So this triple audience challenge creates a delicate balance that writers must navigate to achieve quote-unquote authentic representation, which is a requirement that shapes not only content, but narrative strategies, cultural references, and the very conception of what constitutes legitimate regional crime fiction. And in the novel of the Nera series, I've put a few here for you to see, the detectives navigate between French legal frameworks, multicultural influences, Corsican traditions, often French political interference, which creates investigative methodologies that are hybrid formations rather than simple applications of mainland approaches. Additionally, by writing from within the cultural and political context of Corsica, writers in this series achieve a level of authenticity and nuance that is often absent from mainland French crime fiction, portraying Corsica and Corsican themes. The multilingual reality of Corsica, where French, Corsican, and Francorse, which is the Corsican vernacular, are negotiated in daily life, and that creates linguistic third spaces where characters code switch between languages, using each language for different purposes and cultural contexts, and that's intimately linked to power dynamics, because language use becomes a tool of power. The linguistic hybridity is not merely atmospheric. It fundamentally shapes how crimes are perceived, investigated, committed, and solved. Or other way around. Perceived, committed, investigated, and solved. The question of power, again, is crucial here because where Corsican detectives must negotiate the meddling operated by officials, there's interesting power dynamics at play. I really don't have time to get into this, but it's a very important part. The detective's ability to translate between linguistic codes and power dynamics become not just a practical skill, but a metaphor for cultural mediation in the island context. And there are strong links here, of course, to be made with Mediterranean noir and the place of islands within this movement as spaces in which cultural hybridity manifests itself in genre innovation. The Mediterranean, with its constellation of islands shaped by complex histories of cultural exchange, conquest, and resistance, offer a rich ground for examining crime fiction through the lens of cultural hybridity. And I could name them: Corsica, Sicily, Sardinia, Balearic Islands. They function as microcosms of broader Mediterranean hybridization processes, whilst maintaining distinctive cultural identities that resist the simple assimilation into mainland national narratives. And I've tried to, in the spirit of this project, I tried to look at recent, productions in these islands. So I must, apologize, because this is not my area of specialty. I don't know anything about these writers that are not French or French speaking. I'm just trying to basically throw a line and see what will bite from other scholars. And so what I've observed with Corsican crime fiction, I'd like to argue could be extended to writers from Sardinia, from Sicily, from Cuba, from the French Caribbean. And interestingly, in the case of Martinique, you have Olivier Arrighi, who is originally a Corsican writer who migrated to the Caribbean, and that has been able to actually transcend that and create something that is a hybrid and an interesting evolution of Corsican through Martinique Creole context. So the idea here is that I think these patterns recur in these other island contexts, and I'd be curious to see how they occur, if they are similar, and what are the variations? What are the variations that we can see? And so further afield, outside of Europe and the Caribbean, we could think of Japan, even though Japan would be slightly different because it doesn't, islands in Japan wouldn't have the same mainland island dynamic. But because there's a really important crime fiction hub in Japan, the question needs to be asked. So what I'd like to propose is that there could be recurring patterns across diverse island contexts, which would reveal something more profound than just isolated instances of cultural hybridity. The big question is, what would we find if we were to put all these islands together? If we were to analyze all the crime fiction coming from these islands, if we were to look at them from an island-based perspective, as opposed to a mainland-based perspective, with the crime fiction from these islands belonging to a mainland tradition. So what would we find? And so I'd like to think that these network of island crime narratives, whilst being separated by vast geographical distances, would share fundamental characteristics born from similar experiences of liminality, cultural exchange, and in some cases, resistance to mainland domination. And so in order to really go further with this, we must move beyond examining islands as individual third spaces and begin conceptualizing them as part of a broader network of islands and a broader archipelagic system. And this is where Edouard Glissant comes into play, and that's where I'd like to conclude, like a reverse conclusion, if you will, trying to open it to broader questions. But by recognizing multilingual island networks in crime fiction as manifestations of cultural hybridity, we can move towards Edouard Glissant's archipelagic thinking, which would be a non-hierarchical, more rhizomatic approach to cultural and literary analysis that privileges relation over isolation. And in this respect, going beyond the traditional opposition between islands and continents, it implies recognition of each place, language, and culture within a relational globality. The archipelago thus implies a dynamic conception of identity, which exists only through contact between differences, which are constantly exchanging and metamorphosing. So this approach transcends traditional comparative methodologies by acknowledging the complex networks of cultural exchange that shape island literatures. And for crime fiction scholarship, adopting archipelagic thinking would mean examining how island-based crime narratives relate to each other, not through metropolitan centers, but through direct connections and shared patterns of cultural hybridity. And this connection form what Glissant calls a poétique de la relation, a poetics of relation, or a network of cultural exchanges that generates new literary forms through ongoing processes of creolization. Therefore, examining islands in crime fiction from a multilingual perspective I think could reveal a network of literary texts that both globalize and decenter the genre. This occurs by globalizing the genre beyond the island-mainland dichotomy and doubly decentering it through both excluding mainland narrative to focus solely on islands and emphasizing the multilingual power of island networks as sites of cultural hybridity. So this is a bit of a first step towards what I'm hoping could become a larger intellectual endeavor. And I've tried to map initial theoretical coordinates to study multilingual island crime fiction. And I don't claim comprehensiveness. I'm not a specialist of anything other than French crime fiction. And so I'd like to call scholars working across Mediterranean, Caribbean, Southeast Asian, Pacific crime fiction to join in creating connections to shed light on something that's previously been quite isolating. And I think I will stop there. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clara. So interesting, your project. I guess I like the relational and multi-spatial context that you are offering or creating. And I like definitely your call for action.
Well, I mean, you're here, you're a specialist of Cuban crime fiction.
Yeah. I'll ask maybe a question later, but
Yeah.
then I will open to other people who may want to make comments, questions. Remember, you may ask a question or simply make a comment, but Stuart, number one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Clara. I really enjoyed that presentation, as I've enjoyed all the presentations I've heard you give. I was wondering, how much does there need to be an awareness of islandness in the novels themselves? Because I'm just thinking, for example, I know you're talking about multilingual versus, say, the Anglophone, but Britain is an island, Australia is an island.
Yes,
we can see them as in Conan Doyle and in say Wilkie Collins. There is that sense of connection through empire to different languages, places, peoples, etc. So, but there's not necessarily always an understanding of islandness as part of that experience of being in London, say, or in Melbourne.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it's one of the blind spots of this, like for scope. Like I think what I've observed in Corsica and the dynamics that I've observed, I think could be observed elsewhere. It's not comprehensive, but what I was mentioning for Japan, for instance, could be applied to Australia. These island nations, right? Island nations, I think, are something that would have different dynamics than islands that are part of a country that is not that island, if it makes sense. And so I think the relationship with mainland, even though it needs to be shunned in a way to shed new light on the island, is important to delimit, is the word, delimit the scope of the project. But there are, as you know, there are rich crime fiction traditions as well. Islandness is experienced, like the islandness in Corsica is not going to be experienced the same way as the islandness in Australia.
No.
Because there is this confined space. And what is the function of this confined space with crime fiction? And I think I can, I'm thinking here of Agatha Christie, and then there were none. And so this sense of seclusion of the island is not depending on multilingual, but I guess the multilingual endeavor here is to shed new light on things that might not have been, traditionally explored in scholarship before.
Yeah, I think in the case of Japan, there's we could talk about Hokkaido, for example, which has its own indigenous population. So we could see that as separate to what would be the metropole. I'm trying to remember, I've read about 8 or 9 Seishi Yokomitsu novels, and I don't think he gets to Hokkaido, but there is a novel which does, but I will follow that up.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart.
Barbara.
Okay, so I was on mute. Anyway, I came across the same issue because working on islands myself, and and having a project on that, I was asking because I come across with the fact that 70% of the Earth, the surface of the Earth, is islands. So potentially, if you only consider the geography, like island as a geographical expression, then it becomes, something that you cannot really manage, right? Because it's too vast. And as Stuart was pointing out, you have Great Britain is an island, but do they consider themselves as islands anymore? Does Australia considers, its literature seeing and portraying Australia as an island is not necessarily the case, right? So I came to the conclusion that we need to consider the awareness, no? Exactly what Stuart was saying. So I'm considering island crime fiction, the crime fiction in which the idea of the island is prominent, right?
Yes.
Either in the investigation or in the experience of the characters. Otherwise, it's not island crime fiction. These help us a lot. So, and what I normally do is not to consider as much as Japan, but an island in Japan, or not Great Britain as an island, but maybe a crime story set in the Shetlands, right?
Yeah.
Because that help us, because they are framed as island, as the experience of the island. There is a lot of meditation and, discussion among the characters, and the idea of the island really inform the investigation or the stories, the background stories. So this is what so more like a cultural view of islands rather than a geographical one. This help sort of narrow the corpus.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do with the idea of cultural hybridity. So framing the island not just as a geographical setting, but also a theoretical construct of cultural hybridity also helps try and narrow down and form these networks. And so instead of looking at the geographical space, the aim is not to create networks of geographies, but more networks of cultures.
What I wanted to know, I really love your project. It's fantastic. I like the idea of a multilingual island. I found that in some cases the discussion about identity also appears in islands where they are not bilingual or multilingual. So there is something about the island, no? That goes, beyond the being multilingual, right? But definitely multilingual islands are basically a meditation on identity on steroids, right? Because culture. So it's a very good, line of research. When you're talking about archipelago, and I really like the idea a lot, do you also intend to discuss if there is a connection or a conversation among writers? So is it a network that we establish because we see common themes, or we are also looking at clear, literary influences?
Well, that's a very good point. It's a very good question. This idea, when I was talking about regional publishing, I think it's not so much a network of writers, but more a network of publishers. Because the Corsican publisher that, he's now a friend because I've met him so many times. He was saying to me that he spends his time as a publisher half in regional fairs and half in international fairs with other, like he would go, and recently he went to Canada for an indigenous literature promotion event. So I think with the writers, I don't know. Publishers, I know for sure. There's networks. I don't know if they're particularly islands, but networks of regions for sure. Networks of regions for sure. With the writers, I don't know. Corsican writers are terribly hard to pin down to talk to, because most of them write under pseudonym, and so it's really hard to pin them down. But I'm going there in July next year to try and shed new light on that.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because when I think about the Mediterranean crime fiction, there was clearly a network of influences among writers and a conversation among writers. So I'm thinking that if we want to think in the archipelago sense,
Yes.
the connections like network at the level of writers, or as you said, publishers could be another layer, right? Interesting layer to advocate for the archipelago thinking.
Yeah. Thanks for that. It's something that I'm going to add on my list of things to do when I'm in Corsica.
Alistair.
Thank you. Look, Clara, that was terrific. I'll add in. I mean, in a sense, it is a curveball, and yet it's not a curveball because you know exactly how my brain works. So,
Yeah.
and you and Stuart probably know exactly where I'm going before I even go there. But it's the only place I ever go. But I loved it. I loved this paper, and what a couple of things I really liked. With a sort of reciprocal, there's a kind of double movement going on, which I think I've mentioned to you before, and I loved it when you said the way that, you know, island crime is a way of getting people engaged in the island, which is kind of almost the other way around to what one might normally expect. But of course, this is what crime fiction does and how it's used, and its popularity is used to do other stuff. But of course, that other stuff is always present in crime fiction, which is kind of what Stuart and what we've all been doing before. So what I like about this is the way in which you're taking crime fiction and making it something, taking it to a new space, taking crime fiction to a new space, but you're also allowing room to go back to crime fiction, to go back to the center as well as decentering, because you've got that kind of maybe it's not this third space, perhaps it's more of a sort of more straightforward sort of Deleuzian becoming that you have in crime fiction, where crime fiction is always becoming something other than itself, i.e. literary. It's always literary as well as crime fiction. So it has that tendency to drift towards the criminal, but to always pull itself back to the literary. So there's a way in which I love your island thing as a possibility of a metonym or an intensification of the locked room.
Yeah,
and hypercentric almost in that sense. So I like that potential, which would be a different project, obviously, but it would allow you to do things that I can't quite do, but like you're looking at the Rue Morgue as an island, based on its, you know, where in fact almost the opposite of what Barbara was saying, where it's the multilingualism itself which makes it an island in Paris, and then you could then explode the locked room of that text. Yeah. So I mean, anyway, you and I can talk more about that another time. But I do like that way it allows you to go out, but also to come back right to the center too.
I'll go one step further to this in a lot of ways, and that's only pertaining to Corsica because that's my that's my comfort zone. There's also an argument to be made about rewriting crime fiction, because Corsican crime fiction is already written in mainland crime fiction. It's a very common trope. It's a very common place because of all the associations with Corsican, mafia and it is a very common trope that has already been written, and since it has been written prior to the existence of the Corsican Nera series, and in a way one could argue there is a rewriting that's happening at the moment to change the narrative about Corsica, to make it more authentic and to make it less about people planting bombs in French places. So there is a rewriting there somewhere. So going back to a perspective, rewriting the mainland narrative. But I don't want to go too close to that, because the aim of that particular project is also to get out of this land island dichotomy.
Of course.
Well, I've got a question too. I was very interested in the concept of the experience of the triple audience challenge.
Yeah.
Thinking about Cuba, definitely I can see it. I remember reading Cuban crime fiction novels and very often writing down, who are you writing this for? This is an explanation of an Afro-Cuban saint, but everybody in Cuba knows who the Orishas are. And also for the diaspora, because they are people who know a lot about Cuba, but they may have left 10 or 20 years ago. So there's constant updating of, this is the last things that are having happened in Cuba, basically since you left. But I've got a question which relates in general to the whole project. How is that different to any crime fiction from any country in the world? Because I'm writing Spanish crime fiction. I want to appeal to the Spaniards, but also tourists that go to Seville on summer and are looking for a crime fiction book, and maybe also Spaniards living in Australia that will want to read about Spain. So I think part of the most difficult thing of the project would be to prove that this is different to any other crime fiction, or what has island crime fiction that cannot apply to anything else. I'm not asking for a question for an
No,
answer.
I know, but I
Just,
see.
because
I see
when
your
we
point.
were going to start that project, I was thinking about that too. So okay, what is really different about Cuba?
I think it's a very good point. I think this triple audience challenge relates more to the question of authenticity as opposed to the question of islandness. So for me, ever since I started working on Corsican crime fiction, I asked myself, what is crime fiction? How do you define it? What are the limits? Like how can you delineate what crime fiction is? And I think this triple audience challenge is this triple audience factor is probably more related to authenticity than it is related to islands, if it makes sense. So in a sense, the triple audience challenge could relate to the question of authenticity in any crime fiction setting. In a way, but it's more the question of authenticity as opposed to the question of islandness, if it makes sense. I think islandness in this respect, or in the case of Corsica, I think there's also the regional publishing dynamic, and there's the question of scale, because crime fiction, Corsican crime fiction, at the minute can't be global because it's not translated. So you have like the idea of how global it can be is limited to the sheer language, not only the French, but also the multilingualism within it. So I think there's a question of scale with the island. It's always going to be a smaller scale than the national one, for example.
Thank you.
Just following up on the question of authenticity and stereotyping, it makes me think of a novel by a Mallorcan writer called Maria Antonia Olive. And she's got a novel which is partly set in Australia, in Melbourne, in fact. And her character comes to Melbourne, and it's not a Melbourne that I recognize. It's a Melbourne which I recognize if I view Melbourne through Barcelona. And the way in which the city is, the social, the political, and the economic geography of Barcelona is transposed onto Melbourne. Now, I don't have a problem with that because I realize what she's trying to do with that. And she's got this sense of Australia as an island and having a relationship between that island on the other side of the world. The novel's called Antípodas, and Mallorca itself, and there is a connection between the two. But what I think is interesting is the way in which the place gets deformed because of how she's trying to speak to a particular audience. But again, I can see that the question of authenticity perhaps is more important for somebody in a context like Mallorca, about talking about Mallorca or talking about Corsica than it is for in Australia. Although we do get upset, of course, as you know, when people misrepresent us as a land of kangaroos going down the main street and blonde-haired surfers, because I don't correspond to that at all.
But it's true. It's the never-ending question, I think, and I do think that the question of authenticity is extremely important in regions that have a very, what's the word I can use to really accurately represent that have interesting political landscape, so to speak. Like in the context of Corsica, it's called like authentic representation was becoming important. It was becoming important because the way French crime fiction portrayed the Corsicans was being carried as, it was being taken at face value. It wasn't even questioned. So then this stereotype, there were too many stereotypes that were fueling political animosity, I will say. I'm not saying politicians to blame.
It burns more, right? If you come from like either a post-colonial or a quasi-colonial, from a colonial experience, right? Because we have been stereotyped for centuries, and and now you see it in crime fiction too. While with your own crime fiction, you're trying, in fact, to do exactly the opposite, to contrast this. But yeah, I know how you feel, Clara.
No, but I'll share an anecdote with you, which is something that'll stay with me forever. When I graduated from my PhD at the University of Newcastle, the person who was doing the photography, so my uncle and my aunt came from Corsica, had a massive big Corsican flag. And when we took the family picture at graduation, the guy said, "So, how many bombs have you planted?" And I was just, we're in Newcastle in Australia, of all places, and you're asking me that. And so it goes to show how far the stereotype goes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I just have one more follow-up question. How important is is the physical space of an island? So I'm thinking here, for example, of what about a cultural island in which, say, for example, Quebec, surrounded by Anglophone, Anglophone Canada. In what sense could that be considered an island? Obviously, in a geographic sense, it's in a topographic sense, it's not, if that's the right word for it.
In terms of the delineation of theories, I mean, Quebec could fit right in with the third space, the island as a third space for sure. But I'm trying to find Quebec crime fiction, like real Quebec crime fiction.
Yeah.
And apparently crime fiction is not something that's predominant in Quebec literature. But I do take your point, and I do think that I'm worried about scope there, Stuart, though.
Yeah.
Because if
of course.
And also I think that the sea.
Yes, of course, the sea,
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in that case makes the difference, right?
Well, I think the physical boundary which the sea provides is something which is, not the same in the case of Quebec. I was just thinking of things which you could possibly talk about and discount as part of your framing of this project.
But I think the framing for the two parts integral to this framing is the geographical space and the cultural space.
Yeah.
So if you have the geographical but not the cultural, then the island's discounted. If you have the cultural, not the geographical, then I think it's just a matter of delineating. But I can totally see Quebec as a cultural island.
Yeah.
In the concept in the way Omi
Well,
Baba.
in the way in which Catalonia, for example, or can be is that diverse cultural, multilingual cultural space, but doesn't provide the islandness of it. So that the islandness is important. So.
But that's actually an important nuance. Thanks for bringing that up, because then it needs to be made, I think, a little bit more clear that in terms of the delineation of this project, that maybe there should be both the cultural and the geographical.
So how does the multicultural and the multilingual interact with the space, with that particular space, as opposed to other spaces? And there may be similar things going on in multicultural spaces within, say, in Catalonia, for example, as happens in Corsica, but doesn't have the island. And it may happen again differently in Mallorca. And I know there's a lot of Mallorcan fiction which in Catalan, which distinguishes itself from Catalan fiction in Catalan.
Yeah, okay. That's super interesting. I've jotted all these things down.
I was just thinking, Stuart, those, is it Louise Penny, isn't it? Those sort of Quebec novels that are actually written about a French-speaking set, but written in English. So they create kind of, and they do set this kind of little quaint little village isolated, which is kind of unreal, and it's a very different type of third space. But it would be an interesting. It would be one of those many counterpoints that you could certainly be. It's doing a lot of different things, but none of them are possibly, what Clara and Barbara are talking about. But there are funny things going on. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Clara. All the very best with your project, and thanks for the presentation. Fantastic. Before we go, just a reminder that we have 3 more seminars this year. On the 12th of November, Eleanor Gardner and Fiona Wade will be talking about representations of domestic violence in Australian crime fiction. On the 26th of November, I will be talking about communist crime fiction, or the Crime Fiction Internationale. On the 18th of December, Eric Sandberg will be talking about crime fiction and Thomas Pynchon's Two Americas.
Well, thanks for the
Okay.
opportunity to speak and for all your incredible questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.